It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next presentation. I'll introduce Lawrence Abu Hamdan and Doreen Mende, who will both present and then kind of engage in a conversation. Lawrence Abu Hamdan is a private ear. His interest with sound and its intersection with politics originate from his background as a touring musician and facilitator of DIY music. The artist's audio investigations have been used as evidence at the UK Asylum and Immigration Tribunal and as advocacy for organizations such as Amnesty International and Defense for Children International, together with fellow researchers from forensic architecture. Abu Hamdan received his PhD in 2017 from Goldsmiths College, London. In 2019, Abu Hamdan jointly won the Turner Prize for his exhibition Earwitness Theatre and his performance after. In 2017, his film Rubber-Coated Steel won the Tiger Short Film Award at the Rotterdam International Film Festival. Abu Hamdan is a fellow at the University of Chicago, was 2017-2018 guest of the DAAD Kunstler Program in Berlin, and 2015-17 fellow at the Verlis Center in Art and Politics at New School in New York. And Doreen Mende is a curator, researcher, and theorist, is a professor of curatorial politics and director of the CCC Research Master and PhD Forum at the Geneva University of Art and Design. In 2015, she founded the Harun Farocki Institute in Berlin with Tom Hollert and Volker Pattenburg. Her projects include Hamdan zwei Weisen. I studied German for 8 years, and I apologize. In the context of the Bauhaus, Imaginista in Moscow, Berlin, and Bern, Navigation Beyond Vision with the Harun Farocki Institute and Influx Journal at Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. Her work has also been published, among others, by Sternberg Press and in the Oxford Handbook for Communist Visual Cultures. Mende is the initiator of the research project Decolonizing Socialism, Entangled Internationalism, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, and co-founder of the European Forum for Advanced Practices, a collaborative research network. She lives between Berlin and Geneva. So please, let's give a round of applause for Lawrence and Doreen.
Hello. Yeah. So, thank you very much, Moad and Anna, for the invitation. And shout out to one member of the program team, Yasmin Abu Hamdan. So, through the walls of Boris Johnson's London apartment, yeah, we don't escape anything here, leaked out the sounds of a domestic altercation with his partner, Carrie Simmons. In a statement given to the police, his neighbor and witness to the incident said, "It became clear that the shouting was coming from a neighbor's flat. It was loud enough and angry enough that I felt frightened and concerned for the welfare of those involved. After a loud scream and banging, followed by silence, I ran upstairs and agreed that me and my wife should check on our neighbors." Johnson's defenders and employees of Rupert Murdoch accused the witness of being a curtain twitcher. So this kind of like term started circulating, that he was a curtain twitcher all over the tabloids and also a lot of places. But the curtain twitcher is a slur specifically reserved for an eyewitness. Someone who intentionally peers and directs their gaze at an incident out of a kind of assumed unwarranted curiosity. The witness in this case, however, is not an eyewitness, but of course an ear witness. And rather than violating the privacy of another, the ear witness, in this case and in many cases, has their own space, private space, invaded with the acoustic incidents of their neighbors. In terms of acoustic space, at the moment of violent amplitude, as in this case, the witness and suspect occupied, in fact, a shared space. They were in one space together despite the division of the rooms that separate the space visually. Right? Yes. So in turning this witness from an ear to an eyewitness, the press falsely assign intention and equally a debasement of the evidentiary value of testimony. And why it's a debasement is because more often than not, ear witness testimony is treated as a poorer form of testimony. And it's not only treated as a poorer form of testimony, it's treated as a poor image. It's often has, and in this example, of course, is why I start with it, there's the erroneous applying of a visual logic, of visual space, onto a kind of sonic incident. And of course, there's a vested interest in doing that, as I explained. So all too often, especially in the realm of evidence, this happens, despite the fact that ear witness testimony is the most prevalent form of testimony in any trial everywhere, because of the nature of the way in which sound leaks and occupies space, right? So it's actually that's why most of the trials we know of the last 10 years, even 20 years, have all hinged on some form of ear witness and the contention of that in trial. And I could go on to say that this kind of poor understanding of sound, this understanding of sound as a poor image, is in fact one of the reasons why we've seen the kind of legal gymnastics that allow people like George Zimmerman, Darren Wilson, to murder people without any recourse to justice. Oscar Pistorius in his first trial also. Each one of those depended on ear witness testimony, and each one applied a visual logic to sort of space, and in each one the perpetrator, who clearly killed someone, went off scot-free. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about today is not that. I'm going to try and talk about the inverse. I want to understand what would be at stake in the configuration of sound to image rather than image to sound. That is, using sonic imagination to trouble the image. Rather than sounds being forced to behave in the logic of the image, how can an image behave like a sound? And what is politically at stake in making and seeing images that leak through and beyond their sensory and spatial frame? It is not often that I'm asked to speak about images, and so I wanted to show two examples of the ways in which I have tried in my own work as a visual artist to attempt to negotiate the sonic image. Putting side by side one of my older works from 2012 with something that I'm developing right now and is kind of in development. So I wanted to put them together because in both cases we see how the logic of the sonic image became necessary for me as a sort of way to establish new ways by which claims can be made and formally silence testimony can be heard. What's happening? Here. So in the year 2000, there was a total of 15 fortified border walls and fences between sovereign nations. Today, physical barriers at 63 borders divide nations across 4 continents. This huge increase in the fortification of borders over the last 17 years has not only consisted of razor wire and concrete, but also of a huge increase in so-called immaterial and biometric strategies, which also include the forensic analysis of migrant voices. Immigration authorities around the world have turned to forensic speech analysis to determine if the accent of asylum seekers correlated with their claimed national origins, in order to see whether people who originated from areas perceived to be dangerous enough for them to legitimately claim asylum. And that's what I want to say, that it's sometimes internal to countries, and I'll get to the case of Somalia in a minute. This process is called language analysis for the determination of origin, or LADO, and it was first implemented in 2003. LADO uses its capacities to supposedly derive the truth from an accent to help determine the validity of asylum claims made now by tens of thousands of people without identity documents in Australia, Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Switzerland, and United Kingdom. LADO is mostly conducted by one of 2 private companies based in Sweden, Sprakab and Verified. LADO reports are achieved by soliciting the speech of the claimant's voice via a telephone interview, organized between the asylum seeker and an anonymized listener hired by one of the 2 aforementioned companies. These listeners are themselves former refugees and migrants. They sort of used the sort of open door policy of Sweden in the 80s as a kind of resource of informants, of people to actually get informants on accents coming in now. But of course these people are not trained in linguistics, and they produce kind of unscientific assumptions that are reworked into reports by linguists to bolster the claims of the anonymized former refugee analysts, with international phonetic symbols and a lexical variety befitting of a forensic or expert report for use in asylum tribunals all over the Western world. And this whole issue was something I was working with since 2008. So some people in this room who've known me that long also have been hearing about me talk about this since then. Sorry, Susan Schuppeli. And actually in 2012 I made this work with 9 Somali asylum seekers who had all been negatively affected or had been part of an extremely negative policy to have their accents tested, whether or not they had been themselves deported. Some of them had been rejected based on their phonetic pronunciations. And this was a series of non-geographic maps that we made together to try to counter the single map that the authorities had circulated around Somalia, which was, it divided into 3. It said there's a northern accent, there's a coastal accent, and there's a southern accent. And so it's just simply 2 lines that divided Somalia. And of course, what they were saying is that those lines on the map have no relation to the biographies of people actually living there. And so we tried to sort of make this counter mapping strategy. And what emerged, incidentally, was a kind of sonic image, and I will go on to explain exactly why. So this is this map, and what it does is try to show over the last 40 years what some of the political and social events that people had lived through, who we were together with. And then it starts off very cleanly with the kind of government-ascribed distinction between a northern Somali accent. And also, there's one thing of context I need to say, is that the reason why they divide it in that way is because they say that northern Somalia is safe, and you can return there. So they don't intend to return people there, they just intend to deny asylum seekers status. So most people who, when you see that they're denied, they actually stay here. In this country or wherever, but they have a deportation order on them. So it means that they can't ever go past that. They remain limbo forever, as long as they stay here. But they cannot go back to the north of Somalia, which is supposedly safe. So borders are instituted into the voice, which are actually in excess of juridical borders that actually exist between north coastal and southern Somalia. And then you see each one of those kind of like dialects, if we take kind of for granted the government form of mapping the voice, has its own quality of line. And as we move through these events, you see that these kind of voices start to kind of meet each other, right? As a migration comes from the south to the coastal region, they start to gain in complexity, and they start to become sort of hybridized kinds of linear pattern. And then from the north again to the south, and you sort of move through this last 40 years of migration up and down and through the country, notwithstanding also migrations that go out to Kenya and refugee camps come back inside, until at the end you have this kind of every possibility of every speaking voice, and some that have become kind of mutated in the process. So here is these kind of individual maps. These are the words that they have been rejected by the specific speaker. This is the analysis of the government. This is a kind of contra-analysis. This is a rejected status. And so we made these maps that also try to show on an individual level the same kind of thing happening. That this, if you imagine that dot is them, these are all their kind of interlocutors they speak to on a regular basis, divided into kind of different kind of dialects and things that they constantly need to negotiate their voice with. So each one of those kind of raps is a kind of interlocution, and then again again each one on a quality of line, until at the end you have like this kind of inseparability of the person from the kind of voices in which they constantly negotiate. So an accent should not be understood as a pronouncement of a place of origin, but rather as equivalent to layers of metadata. That's the main kind of claim. Accent is an indication of a voice as a network with nodes in various places, times, and identities. An accent is formed through and in communication with others, and in this sense, that we hear not only the speaking subject, but traces of their past and present interlocutors. The voice has a tendency to mimic the accents of those it speaks to, And so that the sound of an accent is possessed to some degree by every person who's ever come into contact with. So when the accent is heard as a network and not a birth certificate, we hear it as a biography of migration, an irregular and itinerant concoction of contagiously accumulated voices, rather than a kind of distinguishable sound that avows its defined roots within the confines of a nation state. Such irregularities I'm trying to show here, and I've argued in various forums, should in fact provide proof of the applicant's need for asylum. But instead, the sounds of vocal migration have the sonic quality of which have the sonic quality of geographic irregularity, are cited as a grounds of refusal for asylum applications, as Lada promotes a system of vocal governance that deems speakers with mixed and multiple accents as dishonest. Yet in the governance of accents, the border is of course a visual demarcation that dissect a sonic plane. And in these images, I'm trying to specifically invert that, to show that sounds cannot be so easily dissected by the colonizers' cartographic rulers and pens, if anything, in fact, can be. It is through the sonic image, then, that I propose strategies for mapping the voice which are more faithful to the way in which the medium bleed through histories, bodies, and borders. The attempt here is not only to render an image of a sound, but rather to create an image that behaves like sound. And I think that was the main kind of like process. So this is a kind of clear example of what I mean by sonic image. It's about sound, it's tidy. But now I'm going to get a bit untidy. Because the next example of a sonic image, in fact, has nothing to do with sound. And that's what I want to show. I want to see if this idea of the sonic image, which is about like 4 days old and probably not relevant, but I came up with it for this conference, itself can leak past its own disciplinary boundaries, right? That's the proposition, and you can tell me if it works or not. I want to form a generalized relation to the image that is not specifically dedicated to capturing sounds leaking through borders or walls, but in this case, if it can be used to make visible distinct ways in which memories leaking through time, subjectivities, memories. So,
when were you born?
March 27, 1987.
You were born 1987, and when did Yusuf al-Jawhari die, you in your previous life?
February 26, 1984.
So when was you,
As Yusuf al-Jawhari.
as Yusuf al-Jawhari, born?
1967.
1967.
So this is Basil, and it's a clip from a film I made last year, which is an interview with Basil Abi Shaheen. He's the son of my cousin's cousin. He's my age. We just call it cousin, where we're from. It's not really like that, but you know, I know you guys like this precision. So he's my age roughly, and he in fact believes himself to be the reincarnation of Yusuf al-Jawhari, who was a soldier who died at 16 during the 1984 Shufor in Hamdan in Lebanon. And this is one of the most kind of like unspoken is the wrong word, kind of like distributed, individuated, unresolved parts of the Lebanese civil war, because it's really a moment when villages which really had coexisted with a few blips mostly for around 1,000 years kind of broke apart and still remain vacated from either sect, each line. So Basil's reincarnation is not unusual, to me at least, in that he's born to a religious community who believe in reincarnation. And this is the same community that made up the majority of the militia which he fought in his past life, which were the Progressive Socialist Party, Hizb al-Ishtiraki. In the context of this presentation on the politics of the sonic image, I will be unfolding only one strand of Basil's story. So this story kind of like goes in many directions, but I'm kind of pushing it through this idea of the sonic image. And one that particularly refers to Basil's search for his own image. So Basil's flashbacks to a time in which he did not himself live have compelled Basil to become an obsessive autodidact historian. A young man pushed to find traces of his own existence, used his reincarnation to amass not only information about his own life, but the largest archive of photography, weaponry, uniforms, flags, and badges of the Shufor and the entire militia of the Progressive Socialist Party. Basil has now become a historical resource. He holds vital information for anyone hoping to understand the historical record of a time which has been cancelled from history. Basil began by collecting martyrs' posters from that period, hoping to find a correct record of his own death and an image of who he used to be. Through a family contact, Basil connected with one of the militia's key graphic designers and poster printers. And the now elderly designer gave Basil free rein amongst his disordered remnants. Amongst his old defective prints, flags, and never released designs, he eventually found one in which Yusuf's name appeared, him in his past life. The space where his image would normally appear was blank, and so Basil left the designer's house not only with this poster, but with many of the half-discarded posters, flags, and badges that he could carry. And this is the very kind of like foundation of him becoming the collector that he became. Basil still sought to procure his own image, and up to that point he had avoided exactly what would lead him to it, his parents from his past life. But inevitably one day, Basil knocked on the door of the Jawhari family home in Hamdan, and his former sister opened the door. Basil announced who he was and who he had been, and he was quickly welcomed inside. The elderly man sitting on the balcony, Fuad al-Jawhari, Yusuf's father, rose to shake his hand. Fuad gave him the uniforms Yusuf wore during the war, including the one in which he had died, and the rifle he had used. But when Basil inquired if there was a photograph he could have, his former father explained that the only existing image they had of Yusuf was an out-of-focus black and white image taken when he was 6 years old, adding that Yusuf hated having his picture taken. Thinking that maybe many of his ex-comrades from the war in Alay might have a picture of Yusuf, Basil began to locate and interview whomsoever he had known in his past life. This is how he began accessing and archiving personal photographs and collecting memorabilia of many ex-fighters. Starting with people who had fought and trained with Yusuf, and then people who had fought and trained with those people, and then people who had fought and trained with those people, and so on and so forth, until he created a network across the mountains of ex-fighters and their family members. Basil's reincarnation has given him access. His reincarnation and his research are inseparable. If a bona fide historian were to show up at these houses asking for such documents, they would be told very flatly that none exist. But as a returned fallen comrade, Basil is treated differently. Amongst a community of those who believe in reincarnation, he is, after some explaining, welcomed inside, and then eventually, for the most part, available to collect and archive this material. So, I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, because when he first goes, they tell him that all the images are burnt and destroyed. And then slowly, as his story unfolds, he realizes that's not in fact the case. So he's managed to sort of acquire this photographic collection. Basil is in a unique position to traverse the silence that spanned 2 generations. One is silenced by the necessity and responsibility to avoid stirring up a sectarian past in which they fought, whilst the other is silenced by the absence of historical teaching and cognizance of the war outside of kind of like rumor and personalized narratives. So in this way, his testimony, whether learnt or unlearnt, whether planted or transmigrated, make formerly impossible speech possible.
And how young were you when you started fighting?
As young as 14 or 15.
And so do you think you could have been one of these kids here? Because this is from Alay, right?
I'm not 100% sure.
But you never looked at the faces in the background and tried to identify if any of them were Yusuf al-Jawhari?
I try, but it's hard to tell because I don't know how I looked like, and I still look for, till today, I still look for my picture. And I can't manage to find any picture. Although many of my ex-friends or ex-colleagues or ex-fighters who used to fight with me say, you may have pictures of you in Alay if you go up and you search in Alay.
But you don't know what you look like.
No,
so.
I don't know what I look like. So I don't know how to figure out how I look like, or how am I going to identify that myself. Unless somebody tells me this is you, that's another story.
So, as he says, Basil has very little idea of what he looked like in his previous life. This is the only picture that I referred to before, when he was 6 years old. But he may have an image in his vast archive, but without knowing what he looked like, he cannot identify himself amongst his collection. With the idea that we could try to see if indeed such a picture exists amongst his collection, I approached Dr. Caroline Wilkinson at Face Lab, a research group at Liverpool's John Moores University that carries out forensic archaeological research, including craniofacial analysis and facial synthesis. I asked her if she could use the image of Yusuf at 6 years old, as well as reference images of his brother and his father, and reconstruct what he may have looked like at 16 years old. And this is the result. The process she uses to create this image is often used in missing persons cases, particularly when someone goes missing as a child. And she explained to me that she has had astonishing results. Most recently, she produced a facial synthesis of a woman from her skull alone, and by circulating this image to a public, an old neighbor identified that reconstruction as someone who she had known and who had disappeared many years prior. This is how the police were able to identify the body. Do you hear me okay? Is fine? Yeah. At the back? Okay. Dr. Wilkinson explained to me that her success in such cases depend on staying within a tight threshold of recognition. The face has to be both specific enough to elicit the memories of those who have seen the face before, while also generic enough not to overstate any one specific characteristic for fear of throwing people off the trail of identifying them. You need to open and activate the interpretive capacities of the viewer. And to do this, the faces have to also be somewhat digital. There has to be enough digital artifacts, like the intentional pixelization around the ears, to be able to tell that this is indeed an illustration and not a real photograph. Because if you think it's a real photograph of someone, then you think that that's them, right? So you have to kind of constantly play within this threshold. At the same time, the face cannot be completely digitally rendered, because Dr. Wilkinson needs the public to see the face as real and as believably human to solicit some kind of urgency. They found when they circulated digital images, there wasn't this kind of relation to it. It needs to have this kind of texture that is not like those Pixar films. So, to keep this human threshold, she must use real human facial features. So each of the features that make up this image are actually cut and copied out of anthropological archives and photographic databases. To make her database, Wilkinson collects endless portrait books, including titles such as Berbers of Africa, Faces of the Zulu, The Atlas of Beauty, Women in the World in 500 Portraits, Crowns, Portraits of Black Women in Church Hats, The Photographer's Guide to Posing, Techniques to Flatter Everyone, The Moment It Clicks, Tibetan Portraits. She harvests from these books eyebrows, hairlines, noses, eyes, mouths, chins, facial hair, and skin textures. And then she intentionally erases the source of these images so that they become a sea of unidentified stray features floating away from the faces to which they were originally attached. She does this to limit her own cognitive racial bias and to focus only on the distinct features she feels that would best fit the face that she's reconstructing. So she recreates this massive mix so she will not be tempted to use too many features of one single face. It has to be totally mixed, because if she uses too many features of one face, she risks recreating an incident from an FBI investigation in 2011 when they were looking for Osama bin Laden as an older man. They released this image to the public, and it was actually they used too much of the face of this guy, who is a Spanish politician, Gaspar Limares, and many Spaniards recognized him. He became a butt of many jokes, and he was furious, and the FBI were forced to retract the image and apologize. So for Wilkinson, this became a lesson, and Wilkinson didn't do this, but she told me about it. It became a lesson to choose each feature separately. And in order to be able to complete Yusuf's face, Wilkinson must look through her unaccounted catalogue of features before fixing on the faces of the 8 people that ended up constituting this one face of Yusuf al-Jawhari. His eyes were chosen because at a young age he seemed already to have eyes which sat shallow in their sockets, eyes where the lids protruded, and the lips were the only thing that she had to significantly alter, puffing them up to match the development of lips in his family. The memories that are lodged in Basil's mind are not a product of empathy for the trauma suffered by the generation which preceded his, for empathy suggests otherness. It is not that he can feel another individual's pain, but that through reincarnation, individuality itself become undermined. And this is why, for me, learning about Wilkinson's process and this creation of a face made of many faces is somehow the perfect portrait of Yusuf, regardless of whether it looked like him or not. I mean, I still want to get closer to what he looked like, but I think it's the process itself somehow has this echo of the ways in which the memory circulate through the returned, the testimony of the returned. But why then is this a sonic image? I say this. When an image behaves like a sound, when its truth value is derived out of its relational rather than its individual qualities. The material conditions of sound make it an inherently difficult article of evidence, as it cannot be isolated from the space in which it resounds. Sound waves, unlike photons of light, do not themselves move through the medium, but rather cause a rippling effect that create the movement of molecules around them. So the objects themselves vibrate, not the photon of light moving as an object in itself. The vibration of sound is therefore a collaboration between molecules of distinct objects. And this is why analyzing sound is a challenge to the ways in which evidentiary fragments and chain of custody are conventionally managed. Sound and a sonic imagination therefore act as new propositions for soliciting evidence and in turn for producing and reading images that are continuous with the omnidirectional and uncontainable way that sound propagate both throughout the space of a building, through the border of a nation, and through the architecture of memory itself. So at stake in the sonic image is an end to an isolationist practice. That's basically what I'm saying. An end to the ideology of monolingualism, to binary forms of identitarianism. And I've tried to show that when the logic of acoustic inseparability is applied to image production, counter forms of testimonies can be made audible. And new forums, in fact, for that testimony can be made audible in the case of Basil. So an image that behaves sonically can become a medium for truths to emerge that are impossible in a world in which our listening to testimony is still governed by the tight confines of the visual image. That's thank you.
Okay.
You need this cable.
Oh, I have one.
I think you have the
I
adapter.
think I have this is already connected because of different.
No.
Ah. Voila. Okay. Oh, voila. Yes. All right. So, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. We conceived this conversation as a matter of presenting each other's kind of activities and research urgent questions at this very moment, and then enter a conversation. I already have a question for you, Lawrence, in relation to what you've presented and what I'm trying to share with you now. And I've prepared a kind of a text, and I start. Thinking with Farocki. There is a difference between thinking of someone and thinking with someone, or thinking of something and thinking with something. While a thinking of carries the weight of a past memory, a thinking with projects to a future trajectory. This shall be my point of entry for this short intervention, where I will soon elaborate on a few activities of the Harun Farocki Institute that, Anna, thank you for your introduction. I co-founded in Berlin in 2015. Greetings from Tom Hollert and Volker Pantenburg. We will see how we can activate a conversation between a practice committed to the image complex, as I would like to suggest to think the image investigations of Farocki at this moment, as we encounter Farocki's work, and the practice committed to the sonic image, as Lawrence Abu Hamdan proposes through his oral investigations. I have the feeling that there are quite some crossings indeed, however, from completely different points of departures, yet similar politics. Surely there are many, endlessly many things to remember of Harun Farocki. In the context of this conference, I'm thinking of Harun Farocki's immense capacity always to point us to the politics and the pleasure, or the drama and or the dreams and nightmares of contemporary image-making technologies. Thinking of Farocki makes me think of his always contemporary or already future-situated concern regarding an analysis of the image by the means of the image, with the objective to foster, to advance, to popularize, to practice a visual literacy through which we may learn to live in this world, through which we may understand one world within this world, or through which we would make a world at the end of this world. I am also thinking of Farocki's capacity to mobilize a pedagogy in transit, never a place of condescending mastery, that emerges between the image and reality, or between proximity and distance, for which a certain discomfort or disorientation appears as a point of departure, a condition of thinking, or a mode of research starting in the middle. Farocki's interest in gaming, and this is here in the context of this very lovely exhibition, he unfolds in serious games, which is on display next room. For example, it is not the fascination with the spectacle of war or virtual reality or simulation of reality. Farocki never had played a computer game himself, yet he observed the obsession of his collaborators' kids with gaming cultures, and thus computer-generated images as what he calls the ruling class of images today. By analyzing the ruling class of images, as Farocki would call computer-generated images in a talk in June 2014, shortly before his untimely death, he follows a political urgency to study, to learn, to create, and to rehearse a vocabulary for articulating a distrust in images, which I think was already at stake in an earlier panel, the distrust in images, and I think this is something we share here already. This distrust in images as a measure of an always imperfect visibility of reality, which Thomas Elsässer did elaborate further, specifically in regard to parallel 1 to 4, also next door installed, in relation to a cinematic mode of production of the image that Thomas Elsässer described with the labor of invisibility. In Farocki's last lecture at IKKM in Weimar in June 2014, he spoke of this new ruling class of images today, computer-generated images that fabricate or rather predict and anticipate, and I quote him, a strongly produced world, not a reproduced world, highly artificial with millions of details. Participating in this unbelievable adventure means to create a world by an actionable image that Susan Schuppli has been elaborating on, and that also was for Farocki very important, by reading also Alexander Galloway's book on gaming, algorithmic cultures. This actionable image that you can navigate, or as he wrote in the same talk, computer animation is less a reproduction or representation and more a production or creation of a model world. Here we are in the middle of thinking with Farocki, as I would like to see our activities at the Institute in relation to Farocki's work. And I'm going to show now a few things, just as a kind of a few windows into the things we do at the Institute, because the Institute is a double-fold. We take care of the kind of archival kind of substances of Farocki's work, that we do not archive Farocki's films themselves or the video installation. This is all maintained by the family and the kind of, the film production company. But everything that did not make it into a film yet has been constitutive as a research material for making a film. The books, archival remnants, correspondences, advertisement, brochures, archival films, etc. So thinking with here means thinking with images, with sounds, with words, as well as with absences, silences, and cutouts that create a condition for entering into study. As Jack Halberstam writes in the preface to the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, that always already is different than the museum institution or the academic study department requires from us. Rather, thinking with prepares us to be embedded in what Stefano Harney calls the with and for, against what, against whom. Thinking with prepares us for what will come as a relational practice, and I appreciated this in Lauren's talk, to point out this concern with the relation, and the relation practiced both chronopolitically and spatiopolitically. That means the politics of time and the politics of space, spatiality, geopolitics. So this just point to a few kind of activities. We are like part of our research activities or everyday kind of encounters to mobilize the archive of the present condition is to enter, to make these kind of pamphlets. And I'm just going to focus on one specific pamphlet that relates to the film Etwas wird sichtbar, or Before Your Eyes Vietnam, by Farocki from 1981. Where well, I just will just screen a very short sequence that we found in the archive of that film. The film is a reflection on the ways how the war in Vietnam has arrived in images and sounds, but also books, in an imagination from a kind of a filmmaker and Western society audience that is sitting kind of in West Germany at that time, being kind of educated about the Vietnam War through images, sounds, and books by Susan Sontag, among others. And the whole film, 10 years after the Vietnam War was kind of mediatized, highly in the main discourse for artists, politicized the whole generation of artists, Farocki makes this film, Before Your Eyes Vietnam. And I would like to share with you a short sequence of a remnant that we found and digitized in the archive. Ronny und Harun spielen Theater, which is what you see is a 6 minutes kind of teaser for the film projection to take place of the film in 1981, 82, excuse me, in the Berlinale, I always mix them both, Berlinale, the film festival, where the film was on display, and the film, what you see here, the sequence, is a film projection by other means. It's a sequence from the actual film that is enacted by Ronny Tanner, an actor that is the main actor also in Before Your Eyes Vietnam, and Harun Farocki himself, and I would like us to understand this as a film by other means. And just also to share with you something that we found in the archives, because it's quite compelling. Does it work?
Wir sind jetzt im Delphi-Kino. Farocki macht Werbung für seinen Film Etwas wird sichtbar im Foyer, und das wird über Pilotton.
Kommen Sie etwas näher, wir bevorzugen die leisen Töne. Treten Sie etwas näher, bitte. Meine Damen und Herren, wir spielen jetzt einen Ausschnitt aus dem Film Etwas wird sichtbar. Kommen Sie bitte noch etwas näher. Die Sache ist sonst furchtbar laut. Das Theater ist der Film ist kein verfilmtes Theater. Ich werde Ihnen kurz die Szene exponieren. Das hier ist der amerikanische Soldat Tanner, dargestellt von Ronny Tanner. Der amerikanische Soldat Tanner war im Luftraum über Nordvietnam unterwegs, wurde von einem Kind abgeschossen und befindet sich jetzt im Gewahrsam der nordvietnamesischen Bevölkerung. Das hier ist der Schreibtisch, um ihn herum Hunderte und Tausende neugieriger Nordvietnamesen, deren Vielzahl ich darstellen werde, die ihm Fragen stellen. Die Fragen richten sich an das Material, auf das Material, das er mitgebracht hat. Was ist das für eine Zeichnung?
Unser Operationsschema. Ein Flugzeug macht eine Fotografie von einem Dorf. Einen Monat später macht es ein zweites Foto und wir vergleichen die beiden Fotos. Hat sich etwas geändert? Also gibt es dort Leben. Also wird das Dorf erneut bombardiert. Ein primitives Schema, das die Vielschichtigkeit des sozialen Lebens nicht fassen kann.
Was sind das für Bilder?
Das ist der Abdruck eines Fußes mit Gummisandale. Aufgenommen aus 10.000 Meter Höhe von einem Aufklärungsflugzeug. Wir versuchen aus diesen Bildern etwas herauszulesen. Das ist der Abdruck eines Pneu Michelin. Das ist der Abdruck eines Goodyear-Reifens. Meine vorläufige Hypothese: die Veteranen aus der Viet Minh-Zeit tragen Michelin, die in den letzten 10 Jahren Rekrutierten tragen Goodyear. Auch aus der Tiefe des Profils ließe sich einiges herauslesen. Wie lange hält eine Reifensandale? In der Stadt, auf weichem Boden, auf Fels. Was wieder Rückschlüsse auf die Dienstzeit, Mobilität und Mortalität erlaubte. Aber eigentlich bin ich kein Soldat mehr, eher ein Philosoph.
Was ist das für eine Philosophie?
Die Philosophie fragt, was ist der Mensch? Ich frage, was ist ein Bild? In unserer Kultur haben die Bilder zu wenig eine Bedeutung. Die Bilder werden in Dienst genommen. Man befragt die Bilder, um Informationen zu erlangen. Und nur die Informationen, die man in Worten oder Zahlen ausdrücken kann. Im Übrigen glaube ich, dass die Geräusche noch weniger geachtet werden als die Bilder. Ich habe in Vietnam gelernt, auf die Geräusche zu hören. Wobei man wieder aufpassen muss, dass nicht einer kommt und eine Musik daraus macht.
Ein Ausschnitt aus dem Film Etwas wird sichtbar, morgen im Delphi, ab nächsten Freitag im Cinema.
Kann man dazu was fragen?
Diskussion schon bei dem Trailer, ja?
Nein, zu dem Operationsplan.
Ja, doch gleich.
Dass der Operationsplan zum Beispiel in Heidelberg in einem Computer ausgedruckt wurde und dass zum Beispiel in Heidelberg die RAF den Computer zerstört hat und dass zum Beispiel die RAF bei uns als Terroristen gesucht wurden und die RAF in Nordvietnam als Friedenskämpfer auf Flugblättern zu sehen war.
Das ist doch keine Frage. Das ist doch eine Mitteilung.
Before Your Eyes Vietnam was kind of one of the films that were constitutive for an Academy Farocki now, that we organized as the Institute in the framework of a large retrospective in fall 2017, and we invited 6 different study programs and research groups from around the world to engage with the work of Farocki, and this is also kind of a gesture or kind of one approach that we have chosen in order to facilitate thinking with and working with the work of Farocki as if an image or the sound or Farocki's film could be the interlocutors in order to update or to kind of think in the spirit of Farocki, to always engage and formulate a contemporary condition of image-making technologies. So in this academy framework that took place in fall 2017, Susan Shubli was involved, Laura Mulvey, Natasha Tatagigian, groups from Alexandria in Egypt, Jakarta, Indonesia, where I will elaborate very briefly, Potsdam, Philadelphia, and Berlin, engaged in the archive, in the films, but also in the remnants of Farocki's archive over 6 months. And I would like to, well, I mean, just, you know, was lovely. It was really great. We would like to do another academy again, but it's not yet in the making, but just to indicate a bit kind of the framework. I just thought nice image to also share with you. But I would like to specifically point out the contribution by Politicizing Image Ltd, Limited, sorry, that was brought together by Ruan Gruppa, Forum Lengteng, Laba, where the political theorist and curator Andreni Vidiashi presented an analysis of the propaganda film Betrayal of the Communists. That was a film from 1984 that has been formative for a whole generation in Indonesia that was trained in that film into kind of the propaganda and ideology of the New Order regime. So it's basically a film that is narrating the atrocity or the creating kind of an ideology to find the socialist and communist movements in the Indonesian society, and it was screened like once a year annually on the 30th of September to commemorate the failed coup of 1964. And that then was installing the New Order regime under Suharto. And Andreni kind of mobilized the methodology of Farocki from images of the word inscription of war specifically, but also Before Your Eyes Vietnam, in order to provide a reading and an analysis of this specific film that has been formative for a kind of a whole generation to be kind of educated in an ideological sense into the New Order regime. And this is something that we are very interested in pursuing further, this kind of thinking with and working with Farocki in terms also of question of methodologies, in terms of updating, in terms also of understanding the image also as a network, as an infrastructure that is running through political movements and political realities. And in that sense, I would like to just finish basically with this last chapter that I would like to share with you as another iteration of the Institute, where we are very much committed not only to maintaining archival kind of trajectories and substances, but also we are committed to research projects and research trajectories. This is also where I would like to situate that thinking with, in terms of engaging into collaborations and ideas that depart from Farocki's work and that we pick up and take further. And one important kind of research is this concern for and the politics of navigation. And I just would like to read and map out a very kind of brief framework that we've been like profoundly developing from Farocki's proposal that he made in 2014, something that he has been thinking with, I mean, much longer than 2014. It started with also like the Serious Games 2017, when Farocki started to look into the ways of images being mobilized as operational images, kind of an idea that he developed around 2000 phantom images is a very important essay. And we also know, all of us here in this room, that Farocki was committed to the idea and the concept of montage, but always also updating this montage as a kind of a political practice that is subject to modulations, mutations, transformations in the face of image technologies. And it has been named several times, the Iraqi war around the early 90s has been formative in a profound shift of the mobilization of images and the uses of images, and computer-generated images here as this new ruling class of images. So, by the principle of montage as a political image practice of the 20th century, relied on the static frame to create an impression that there is always more than meets the eye, creating an access beyond the frame of images. This is how Pavle Levy understands the kind of principle of montage from a psychoanalytical kind of perspective, that what is between the frames of the image frames is the excess of the image that situates also the viewer in this perspective of emancipation. We talked earlier about this distancing effect. So this montage as a political image practice of the 20th century, which always produces a kind of a third space for emancipating the gaze from representational norms by forms of visual subjectivation, we have to ask today, and I think this is also here the framework of this conference, what could be a political image practice of the 21st century for questioning the principle of navigation that updates, calculates, and incorporates the frame excessively and continuously into the image-making process. And a few shots here from Parallele, that is next door, just, I mean, to indicate this kind of sequence. And I would like, for the matter of time, to conclude by thinking in relation to this question, also something I would like to engage from this moment, in a second with Lawrence. But here by mobilizing kind of a quote or an observation by Oraib Tukan, who participated in the conference Navigation Beyond Vision that was mentioned earlier, that I find quite helpful to think about a way to politicize that concern for navigation as a kind of a condition to think image technologies in the present. So Oraib published this text, Toward a Navigable Field, that suggests to understand navigation not as the end of montage, but rather as the end of a viewpoint from a securing distance, producing extreme proximity, which poses both the risk of death, being hit, and the possibility of emancipation. So Oraib writes, but seeing from within that extreme proximity, something that also Susan has been pointing out earlier by like really going deep to the ground, or that also I saw in the work by Larry Achiapong and David Blandy when they say being in flesh in the terrible fiction, this extreme proximity to an image, when colors begin to mesh into a webbed hues, can propel a viewer into a field of knowing via seeing a totality. This kind of seeing constitutes a visual literacy, a self-emancipatory type of knowing that begins with grasping images by understanding them past their representational signs. And I think this is something I would like to take on board for the conversation because, Lawrence, I wonder about this representational kind of concern, problematics, or question with regard to the sonic image, because from my perspective and the research also around navigation, this kind of concern for representation is kind of shifted into this continuous mode of production. It's not a reproduction, so we kind of challenge continuously the field of representation by a continuous update, a continuous kind of recalculation of the image if we think of computer-generated images that produces world. Where would you see, do you see this kind of capacity? Because, say maybe differently, this kind of sonic image is extremely promising to develop vocabularies also for the navigational kind of procedure or the navigational movement in order to step out of the scopic regime of modernity that only kind of knows a vocabulary that is tied to the promise of visibility, which we have left. The labor of invisibility. Can you, does this speak to you? Maybe I put it that way. Does this speak to you in terms of the kind of, the possibilities this kind of sonic image is allowing us with regard to the need we have to think about what we do with kind of this totality of space that re-articulates itself continuously? Thank you very much.
Thank you. 10 minutes. Okay. Well, yeah, it definitely speaks to me. That's the kind, that was what, you've said it better than what I was trying to say, essentially, that, yeah, to see past the representational signs is one of the remits of the sonic image, but doesn't stop there. It doesn't tend to another order of representation still. I'm not saying that an accent is it's an unknowable excess. I'm saying you could do this work on accent analysis, but be ready to understand that the failure of a voice to adhere to national frontiers is in itself representative of of a biography of migration, of the way in which a voice, in fact, behaves. And I think that's the way that, I think voice is the easiest way to speak to that because, specifically in the, I think I would just stop there and I would let you elaborate more to see if that comes forward, because I also don't want to take up too much time. But I think it's also connected to exactly what you said in the beginning, that, well, it not only speaks on that level, I think what we were speaking about kind of kept having this sort of resonance as you were talking, specifically also around the idea of, well, you said it, a visual literacy through which we can understand one world in this world, right? But we still seek to represent it, I guess, is my point. Again, it's not that I'm not satisfied with absence. I'm not satisfied with lack of knowledge, as many kind of poetics around art are, right? The fact that there is no image. I want that image to look like Yusuf al-Jawhari. I'm not saying that it shouldn't. It should look like him. And I want to get as close as possible. But in getting close, the closer you get, the more more the image became kind of sonic for me, or started to operate or behave like that. So yeah, I guess that's what I would return to you, that it's not only the undoing of representation, right? Are you there with me on that, or? I think it's similar, even as simple as the way you began of saying it's thinking of is distinct from thinking with, right? But it's still thinking.
Which is different than writing, or forms of inscription. This is, I think what also I favor in terms of this thinking with from a position also of making. Can you say a few more words around this kind of like the representation that is not enough to go beyond that, because I'm a little bit afraid that if we stay in this kind of I'm seeking, let's say, for forms of visualization or the navigated image that is an image complex, which I really appreciate as a kind of an infrastructure, because it allows to enter the problematics from various kind of perspectives, and it also, speaks about the social and political concern, and it is a tool or is a kind of a methodology to mobilize, the excess of the visual by its own means, to turn the image against itself, let's say. And you were relating to this, I wonder, but also what you presented the last, Trevor Packlin made this project of the Eigenface, which is kind of, you compose the face of Frantz Fanon by looking in all those imageries that are circulating online. And which is, kind of challenging these kind of lines and divisions of the representational field and the field of speculation. And is this at stake in?
Certainly, yeah. But again, I would say it's not satisfied with only challenging them. It seeks to create another. For example, in the case of Bassett, okay, for me, what make his work possible is that it has been rendered impossible to have that kind of testimony. That there is no forum for such. Well, there is, in fact, but it's kind of internalized in a very different way. But there is no official or legal forum for which to hear the voice of the returned, right? And that's actually its power, because there has been a series of legal instruments. Or the law has been used by those who want to maintain their autonomy, their power, in order to kind of create specific spaces and times for discourse. And something as kind of something that shouldn't be taken seriously must then be heard as it's not just that the return testimony undoes the possibility of testimony. It's that it provides, it's a new category of witness in itself. And I think that's where it sort of starts to stand. It doesn't mean that he needs to be subject to the same scrutiny of the law. Quite the opposite. He trouble it, as you say. But still, it's for me the most powerful thing is that he re-emerge as a kind of new category of a witness, for which every other channel to witnessing has been abrupted, has been stopped, has been unable to emerge. Yeah.
We could continue, I mean, because I would have something to, but yeah, maybe there is also the.
Ask your question.
No, I mean, it's more like the commentary. I mean, this kind of so it's about like a politicization also of the representation as a political category, because what you are like moving towards is, of course, to create an evidence that can hold the power of the court. So for that, we have to maybe speak about vocabularies. I mean, what kind of category the sonic image here takes in terms of representation. There's this kind of double meaning of Darstellung and Vertretung. And I mean, in the kind of representation as a political category, that you have a parliamentary democracy that needs representation in order to have political debates that can instigate and institute kind of juridical and political realities. Do I get, I mean, this is kind of
yeah, but
to hold on
right.
this kind of certain, or I think it's a matter of vocabularies though, because I think in the field of contemporary art we are just a bit kind of we have gone through all this kind of critique of representation, and Susan Schubli's presentation kind of to go like beyond or behind the scope of visibility. But the question is this invisibility or something else?